Hi everybody, it's David at Tribal Habits and welcome to today's session. We've got a couple of people joining, but I do have a fair bit to cover, so I'm actually going to start pretty well on time today. And today we're talking about social learning. So it's one of our best practices webinars, and we're going to dive into the concept of social learning and how it works in online training in particular. So what it is, why it's important, and then I'm going to look at five practical examples, so five actual examples of social learning in an online training module. So let's get underway. I'm going to jump back into screen sharing and find the right screen. There we go. And I'm just going to bring up chat to go with me. Excellent. So this is a live session. I have my chat box open. So if we have questions as you're going, just feel free to jump into chat and ask away and I'll stop and answer them. I'm going to use a topic in Tribal Habits to drive the discussion today and to demonstrate a few things. Usually I say that what I'm showing you can be done in other e-learning tools. That's not going to be quite the case today. And one of the things we'll talk about is why social learning is such a challenge for a lot of e-learning tools. And you're going to require a more modern e-learning or online training platform to do social learning in an easy way. Otherwise, you're going to have to use a more complex combination of traditional e-learning tools and some features within your learning platform. And I'll get to that as we go through each of the practical demonstrations. Let's start with what social learning actually is though. And so social learning has a few definitions. And if you float around the internet or look at books on training, we'll come up with a few themes. And so the first one is that social learning is a theory developed in psychology, and it proposes that learning is a cognitive process that takes place in a social context and occurs purely through observation or direct instruction. So in other words, the learning occurs where the learning is implemented. And so it needs to be done inside that social context by observing that environment and the people in it. Another implementation or a definition is that social learning, instead of relying on traditional learning modules with low recollection rates, social learning encourages learners to pull knowledge from experts within their organization instead of having knowledge pushed on them. So again, it's talking about the environment the learning is occurring in. And this is a little bit more about seeking out the knowledge, observing it, watching it from other people in that environment who operate in that environment, as opposed to being in a more formal classroom structure outside of the environment where the learning occurs. Another definition, social learning emphasizes the importance of observing, modeling, and imitating the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. I really like this definition. So there's definitely something about imitating that I think is important here. We're observing the learning or the knowledge that we need or the skills of the processes in the context of which they're being used, and then imitating that behavior or learning from that observation. And now we're including things like attitudes and emotions, which I think are very important. That's probably one of the big differences in a social environment. It's a holistic view of learning, which includes attitudes and beliefs, as well as the environment it's in. My definition, or the thing I focus on, is that social learning brings context from the social environment. So that's the environment where you apply the learning. It contextualizes learning. Now, typically, for people on today's session, that social environment will be the work environment. So we're trying to bring context from the work environment into the learning, to give it more context, to give it the ability to imitate from others, learn from others who are already using it, or put it into that context. Now, of course, if you're teaching students or you're teaching something else, life coaching at home, then the environment will be wherever that is, the classroom or in the laboratory or at home or wherever it is you're learning it. Let's think about it this way. Let's consider when we're learning from an instructor, we hear an instructor in a classroom, formalized environment, so not the social environment we implement the learning in, tell us something, teach us something. And we think that's interesting. Yeah, that's good, it's interesting, I'm interested, I'm paying attention. Then we hear the same learning from a trusted peer talking about it in the context of the organization and the environment and the role in which you work in, the same information, and usually you think that's amazing. And I've witnessed this. I've witnessed an instructor in a workshop teach something, and then someone else in the participant group say exactly the same thing. And I can see everyone around the table go, oh my goodness, that's fantastic. Because the person saying it has contextualized it. They've talked about it in context. They are from the social environment. They're endorsing it. They're saying it works. Or actually, and that's the final card, they're not actually saying it the same way. There's actually subtle differences in the way that it's presented, which we don't think or don't immediately acknowledge, but there are actual differences. The way a colleague talks about something who knows all the acronyms, the jargon, the culture of my organization is different from the way an instructor or an online learning module created outside of my environment talks. And even when they're talking about the same thing, they're actually explaining it slightly differently. It's more contextualized when it's coming from my trusted peer. Plus, I trust my peer. And I think trust is important for learning, particularly with adults, which we'll talk about in just a second. And social learning brings in trust because it brings in your environment that you operate in, which you know, and it contextualizes that information into that environment, which makes you trust it more. So let's talk about why these matters are important for social learning. So first part is adults have life experience. They have accumulated knowledge, they have prior learning, they have established belief and value systems, which means that when we're teaching adults, they're not clean slates. They're not the sponges that often children are. And they can find learning, particularly learning which involves change, very difficult because the learning is working against or in this environment of life experience, prior knowledge. Particularly training that involves change, when adults encounter change, not all adults encounter it well. Change often means discomfort or perhaps even temporary worse performance as you relearn or change your habits, or even admitting that what you've been doing isn't the best or isn't right. And a lot of adults struggle with admitting their past actions may be based on something incorrect. So social learning, which emphasizes peer acceptance, imitation, group reflection, can help adults find a way to accept change. And perhaps the easiest thing is that the instructor says something in a workshop and a learner goes, that's stupid. And then someone they trust right beside them says, oh, that's fantastic. I've actually been doing that and it's worked for me. And that same person goes, that's awesome. And that social learning, that social interaction, that social context helps them accept actually this new information. Or someone else is doing it. It must work in my environment. I'm good with it. And so that's what that social learning is about. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, but we're trying to draw in that social environment. And so for me, the issue now for online learning is that this is a really big challenge because online training often has learners isolated, siloed, with little interaction from other learners. In traditional online learning created in something like the SCORM format, two learners can be in the same learning platform doing the same module, and they've got no idea they're both doing it. There is no cross interaction between them. They are completely isolated from each other, and the decisions and things they do in the online training is totally isolated. This is a complete opposite to social learning. It's a total isolation. It's like taking everybody in a workshop, putting them in individual rooms while they watch a video with no interaction with anybody else in the workshop or anyone at all. And so today I've got to find ways to show how we can bring in some interaction from our peers and some social context to an environment which is often isolated. So let's just begin with a few general tips before I get into the practical demo. So first of all, we have to think about load. And if you've ever been on any of my videos on best practices, I talk about cognitive load a lot. And cognitive load is the amount of pressure we're putting onto a learner. And social learning typically involves a higher cognitive load than other forms of learning because there is a high degree of interaction. It's often challenging. There can be emotions. There's an activity and a contribution. In a social learning environment, you can't sit there passively. You have to engage, even if it's the smallest thing. And so it does involve effort, and therefore any interaction that involves effort has to be used when it's appropriate. There has to be a return or a reward on that effort. Social learning works best as well when there's a high degree of change required by learners. So topics that challenge beliefs, fears, or existing thoughts can really benefit from social learning. So a lot of soft skills benefit in this respect. Anything in sales or service or management or leadership, inclusivity or diversity, where we're challenging beliefs, behaviors, or fears. Social learning is great because they can get positive reinforcement from their peers. Anything as well that has variation in content. So I think when you're teaching something where there's multiple ways to achieve a goal, social learning is really good. So sales training is a classic one for that. There's often not just one way to achieve the outcome we're looking for in a sales training module. There might be lots of different ways that suit different personalities or suit different types of products or services. And that's where social learning is great, because it can allow all these different thoughts to kind of bubble up and be shared amongst the group, and people can find the content that works for them. It can also be heavily contextualized into that particular organization, its way of doing sales or services or customers as well. For the same reason, we typically avoid social learning in very factual topics where there's no room for different views and when you have no option but to change. So compliance training is a classic of that. We usually wouldn't use social learning in compliance training because we don't want different views. There is just the one way to do it. We're telling you how it has to be done. And you shouldn't need any kind of, reinforcement here to change, because you have to change or you're fired or there's consequences. It's a brutal version of it, but we don't need all the social learning there. They simply have to change and they have to do it this way. So social learning has no role. Last thing is, social learning needs structure. It needs direction. Social learning does not work well in a very open environment. It kind of devolves into unstructured, random content. So what we're going to look for is some structure around the social learning to help it stay on target and to get moving and to be easy to do to reduce the cognitive load. The more open we make the social interaction, the higher the cognitive load, because people have now got to come up with their own rules and structures and figure out how to engage. And I often see that in a workshop where a facilitator just says, talk among yourselves. And it's very stilted for a while because people are like, what should we talk about? How do we get started? But if the facilitator says, turn to the person beside you and talk about X, the conversation begins immediately. So it's that little bit of instructional design that we need. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's jump into some interactions. And I'm going to look at 5 common social learning interactions: signaling, polling, forum, reflect, and sharing. And they're all ways to allow the actions of my peers in an online learning environment to be visible to me and cause me to think about things, or for me to share my thoughts with others, or for them to share their thoughts with me, to help me either contextualize the learning into my organization, my role, my environment, or to get variations of thought or opinion or answers from my peers. So to bring content in beyond what is simply presented in the online learning module. And so let's begin with signaling. Signaling is the easiest form of social learning. And this page, this interaction here shows it at work. So in this part of the module, I have 2 bits of information. I have an FAQ and an advice. And looking on the side here, I can see 3 people have favorited the second piece of advice. So 3 people have clicked the favorite icon, and that is signaling to me they thought this was important. So this is essentially like a like, a thumbs up, all that stuff you see in Facebook and LinkedIn. It's the same thing we see over there in social media and social interaction, and bringing it into online training. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's the easiest interaction. It's a simple click. And you can imagine that, let's say this section was called FAQs, and we had 6 FAQs, and just scrolling down them, I mean, it's a lot of content for me to take in. I might have a read through it. But if I see 3 of them, I've got a whole lot of likes, a whole lot of favorites, I'll stop and spend extra time on those things. And that's social learning happening straight away. That's my peers telling me, hey, check this out. This is important. Don't skip over it. That's important. And what we've noticed at Tribal Habits is that in our online library, so we've got a couple of 100 modules of ready-made training. And when we look at the analytics in our back end, it's very interesting when we do have one of these sections that has 6 pieces of advice. It's not always the same pieces of advice that are favorited between different organizations, because the context is different. A piece of advice that's really relevant to organization A may be irrelevant to organization B. And by allowing learners to come through and like things, it helps those organizations contextualize that information into their organization and highlight what's really important to that organization. And so that's a really easy way for me to do it. And this does require, though, your e-learning platform to be able to share that content between learners as they make those choices. And in Tribal Habits as well, when you do favorite an insight, we also copy it over into your journal so that you've got that information to use later. So it kind of has a double benefit. Signaling can be done through polling as well. And polling is the next sort of social interaction. So polling begins with the opportunity for me to vote in a poll. And after I vote, I get to see the aggregated results. So I voted for often in this poll, and I can see that I'm a bit of an outlier. Most people are choosing never or rarely. So now I'm learning from my peers. This is just like a facilitator in a workshop saying, raise your hand if, and me looking around the room and seeing who's raised their hand and who hasn't and how I fit within those choices. And so it's causing me to think, that's interesting. Most of my peers don't do it as often. And that's going to trigger a series of thoughts in my mind and thinking and processing about the training that's not actually on the page in the training. There's actually now something happening in my mind that wasn't written on this page. Now I can help with that in the feedback to the poll. I could get people to kind of think about things. If you voted this way, why is that? How are you going with your peers? And I can use polling to do things like current state polling. So at the start of a module, use a bunch of polls where I ask people, what are you doing currently? What's your number one problem? What are you trying to change? And allow people to vote in it and see where they stand so that they're kind of understanding where they sit within the group and maybe getting some of their fears reinforced. Okay, that concern I've got, other people seem to have it, so that's okay. Or I've got something other people don't that's interesting in and of itself, and I'll be thinking about that. And so polling is kind of great for kind of getting all these thoughts in my head and seeing where I sit. I can combine signaling and polling though, by perhaps using a poll where I put in a bunch of ideas and asking someone to pick their favorites. So in this case here, I've just simply listed the 5 things I'm looking at today, but I could have done these as sentences, ideas, implementation steps, changes you could make in your life or in a skill, and then ask people to pick one. So I'm going to pick polling and save, and I can see that's quite popular at the moment. So that's kind of good for me to know. It's reinforcing my choice. It's allowing me to see what other people are thinking. If I pick something different, it might cause me to reflect, why do other people pick things I didn't, and to think through that. But now we've got double benefit again. This polls valuable data for the organization. So the organization is seeing what people are picking. And the organization could use that information now to direct follow-up to the training or things that sit around that training. It's got a triple benefit because now I'm kind of committing to something that I want to do later on. And so we could capture that information over in the journal and say, okay, so that answer that you've given here, you've chosen polling. Well, let's come back to that in a later interaction where we say, take that thing you chose in the earlier poll and let's look for something to implement around it. So I'm kind of committing to a course of action. But in all cases, I'm no longer feeling isolated. I'm feeling like someone's been here before me. There are artifacts of other people at this part of the training, and it's stimulating ideas in my mind and thoughts in my mind, which aren't just the thoughts and words on the screen. Nikki's asked me a question. So which do you prefer, polls or signaling? Here, I kind of like both. I use a lot of signaling in the modules that I design. I like these insight layouts that we have. And I often use insights to summarize key points in a video or a narration that we've done. Or I do a section where I bundle a group. I might do 5 top mistakes and I'll put in 5 mistake insights and just let people linger on some mistakes for a while and just see which ones get favorited from that group. Because that's kind of useful for them to see which has been favorited, highlight those ones, and useful for the organization to see which ones are the most popular. Let's have a look at a third option, and that's a forum. So a discussion forum is a form of social interaction. It's where you can kind of have a chat room where people can be chatting with each other about the training. It's tricky though, and our analysis here is very mixed when it comes to forums. A lot of people think a discussion in the forum is the same as chat in a workshop, but it's actually not. Online discussion forums are asynchronous. That means I can type something, then I have to wait for other people to log in and get to the chat and type something in. So this is not instant messaging in an app like Teams or Slack. This is a discussion forum. So it's probably a bit more like a LinkedIn group or a Facebook group. I've got to wait for people to come in. It's also written, so it's lacking all of the verbal and physical nuances of chat in a workshop. It's also timeless. So that means I could type something into a forum and it's there forever. A learner could come a year later and see that, and it may well be my comments are wildly out of date or no longer relevant, but they're still there. And that's part of the, that's an issue in an asynchronous written online forum. They're also unstructured, and that can be a problem. Sometimes good, but sometimes they just devolve. I think success with an online forum really requires learners to be continually revisiting the forum over a long enough period to have an actual backwards and forwards discussion. So your learning journey needs to support that. The learners need a degree of openness and trust between them. If they don't know each other, the forum is tricky. People can feel very unconfident about talking or about saying something, particularly when it's in written format and there for a long time. And it often needs an engaged moderator to come in and kind of manage the comments, direct discussions, ask questions, draw out conclusions, get things going. We see discussion forums work well where you have a cohort of learners who are going to be with each other for a serious period of time, 3 to 6 months, on a journey. They get to know each other, and there's plenty of opportunity for the discussion forum. But even then I would question, is that forum part of the online learning module, or is that forum actually a separate part of the journey? And I can see Craig's already asked me a question. So what's an alternative to a forum? And actually that's Craig, the exact question I had to answer now. So if we're not going to use the discussion forum, what could we use? So I'm thinking we could use a LinkedIn group or another sort of group. In the same way we could use a Teams or Slack channel or something like that. And in this case here, I'm kind of using the forum not for online learning. I'm setting up just a chat space, an interaction space for people to go outside of individual learning modules and talk as a group. It's more of a cohort opportunity to chat. It's like the time when they're at the water cooler outside the workshop, having the cup of tea, talking about what's going on with the training in the workshop there. That I think is super valuable, but I don't actually think that's an online learning interaction. If we want to do something like this in online learning, I'm going to recommend a Q&A style interaction instead. Usually it's our reflect element in Tribal Habits. And the way it's going to work is this. We're going to ask the learner a question. We're going to let them type an answer. And then after they answer, they can compare the answers that other people have given to that question. It's essentially a structured discussion. So it's allowing everyone to type open answers and then to see what other people have written and reflect and learn upon that. So it's a more focused discussion around a very specific topic. So it's like going into chat and me in webinars and saying, everybody type into chat their answer to this thing. Or a facilitator in a workshop saying, okay, what do you all do in this scenario? Or what's this issue here? And everyone kind of blurts out or talks to the person beside them about what they do. So it's allowing discussion, but in a more structured way, which is more of a learning, point-in-time learning interaction than an ongoing asynchronous, hopeful discussion. And so an example would be here. What's your favorite learning interaction and why? And so I'm going to say my favorite one is polls. You know, they are easy to create and gather valuable information for everyone. And so that's my answer to the question. And once I share it, I then see the answers from other people. So I can now stop for a while and see what my peers thought at this point and spend some time seeing if they're agreeing with me, disagreeing, thinking of things that I didn't think of, interpreting information a way I hadn't considered, and just allowing myself to kind of have a asynchronous discussion with the people around me. Nick's asked me a question. Can you do this in something like Articulate Storyline? You can't, unfortunately. You could ask this question in Articulate Storyline or Adobe Captivate or a similar tool, but you won't be able to share the answers between learners. But you could certainly ask the question and have them answer it. And then maybe you could give them some canned feedback. So that'd be like this interaction I ran here, asking them a question, they gave an answer, and they just got some feedback that I'd written as the content creator. But this is a little bit different down here where I'm allowing this level of interaction between us. I think this is also very valuable for organizations because organizations get this data too. And so you could think about using this reflect in a couple of different ways. We could use it in place of a poll. Instead of saying in a poll, what's your number one challenge with a topic, and then listing what we think are the top 5 challenges, we could just say, what's your number one challenge? And then let people just open answer. And that's good when you don't really know what they're going to say. You might change it to a poll later once you've run the reflect activity through 100 learners and you can see it's really just these 5 things. We may then switch that to a poll to reduce cognitive load because polls are easier to answer than typing everything out. We could also in this one say, what's your next step? What are you going to do next? Or even, how would you adjust the content above into your organizational role? So to actually say to the learner, right, well, how will you contextualize this? Then after they answer, letting them see how all of their peers would contextualize it. That's a great way to present universal knowledge and then allow the learning cohort to contextualize that into the organization. And so if we take that same universal library, say we take a topic out of the Tribal Habits library on, having difficult discussions with a staff member, and then we might say, okay, how would you discuss this thing here in your organization or with your staff? And all the learners from one organization in their Tribal Habits portal type in their answers. I can tell you they're going to be completely different to organization B when they type in their answers. And that's perfect. Both organizations are changing the content to suit their organization. The final option is sharing. And this is an advanced one. This is probably the most advanced social learning interaction in online training. And this is taking reflection to the next level and actually saying to people, do you have useful knowledge about this module? And if so, would you like to add it to the module so it's there for other people to learn from? So we're really going beyond this structured question to the next level. And so usually when we use this, we use our share and insight feature, which you can enable in any section in Tribal Habits. And it puts the share and insight button in that section. And when a learner clicks on it, they can create one of those insight elements we looked at earlier. They can label it up, they can type in their answers, and when they add it in, it will be added as a new insight to this section. And so it will become new content. Usually then we add some information at the top to kind of direct them. It's an optional activity, not everyone should do it, only add it if it's new information. Add knowledge in the level of detail that would help other people, and check that it hasn't been added already. And then there's the ability for when learners get here, they know, well, this is the section where all of my peers have been dropping in those bits of gold, those little bits of information that's worked for them. And we can see we've already got some favoriting of content here. I'm going to favorite that. I like that as well. So it's allowing a range of new information to come in. This is the ultimate social learning. We are really learning from our peers here. Now, this is not an interaction. Yeah, so Steph's actually just asked me the question I was going to do now. You've been a great group today. When should you use this? With care. So you would not use share and insight all the time. It's used very specifically when you're okay with other people adding content to your module. Now, for a lot of people, that's a leap of faith. You've got to trust the learners here. We're letting the lunatics run the asylum, basically. But it's super powerful when used the right way. So in something like sales training, I think it's really powerful. So it's the ability for you to say, we've been discussing, how we explain the benefits of a product or service. We can have a section here where we say, if you're skilled in sales in this product or service, feel free to add scripts, ideas, concepts, scenarios you've handled about this thing we've been discussing in this area. And then they can add it in and people can review it and favorite it and go through it and learn from their peers. And I think that's really powerful. We're sucking all the best ideas out of the best minds in the organization into one collected area in a very structured way. And that is social learning brought to life in its greatest way in an online learning environment. I'm bang on time today, and I'm going to pause there and just take additional questions on the topic that we've got. But in summary, in the 30 minutes that I've had you, we've looked at what social learning is and why it's important. And we looked at 5 different social learning interactions. And I will say that these are more advanced in than simply putting in content and videos and images. And there's a bit of thought that lies behind them. But if you're using things like the signaling or the polls, they're actually very easy to put in and they're a great starting point. And you can graduate up to using Reflect and the sharing interactions as you get a bit more experience in your modules or get more comfortable with it. And certainly if you create a module in Tribal Habits and submit it for review, your free review via our team, we often look for times to put social learning in and give you those little hints or confidence that this is a good time to put it in. I'm going to wrap up the formal part of today's session there because I'm bang on time, but I will hang around and answer additional questions. Once again, thanks for coming along. We run these sessions every 6 weeks and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks very much. I'm going to hang around and answer questions. So if you do have questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to drop them in. I got a question from Georgia. How much social learning is enough? How many interactions is enough? That's a really good question. I don't want to say that it depends response. To an extent it does. I think it's more around what you're trying to achieve. I think if we looked at the two extremes, we can rule them out. So no social learning interaction in a module for certain modules is probably a missed opportunity, although in some compliance modules it would be appropriate. Too much social learning interaction would suggest that this becomes a clutter of information for learners to work their way through. So I think it's discrete. As we saw, some of the social learning interactions are more of a chance for reflection, just to see where I stand amongst my cohort, amongst my peers, and compare my decisions with theirs. They're kind of like a check moment. And those ones are really good. So lots of insights, lots of polls. You probably can't go too wrong with those. They're always a good check-in. On the reflect and the sharing ones, probably a little bit more discretion. They're very high cognitive load activities. So we don't want to use them too often because you can burn out learners when they're doing them. And they also lose their value. I think I do want to come to training to hear what the training module and the instructor has to say. And then I'd like to contextualize it by a bit of discussion with my peers. I think when the balance flips, when I feel like I'm getting nothing from the module, nothing from the instructor, it's all from the peers, the cognitive load is very high, it's very unstructured. I don't think we want that either. So it's a little bit Goldilocks. I'm sorry I can't give you an exact number. I think it's a bit of a gut feel. And that's a great thing where if you're unsure, you ask for your topic review from us and we'll have a look at it and tell you whether we think you've gone overboard. Helen's asked, what about capturing implementation results? Yes, I think it's a great way to do social sharing. And I didn't really go through it in today's session, but I did have something set up here in this activity. So in this activity, we asked people to go out and implement a social learning interaction and then report back on how they went. And the final part of that activity is they type in what they chose to implement and the results they got. And after they do that, they can see how other people went at that moment. And so they can see what other people chose to do and how they went. And in a previous life, I ran soft skills training and it was on a particularly challenging topic for people. It was on client referrals and a lot of people struggled to get their first client referral discussion done. And we used Tribal Habits to roll that out. And the final, one of the activities, I think in module 3 or 4, was to go out and have a client referral discussion and talk about how it went. And that was the breakthrough moment for most people. They got nervous, but when they got in there, if they've done it, that's great. They can report on it. If they didn't do it, which is an option, so they could say, I didn't do it, and then they can report on what their problems were. But after they reported on that, they saw the results from everyone else. And most of those comments were, it was much easier than I thought. It was great. It went really well, or it was a little rough, but I got through it and I'll be better on the next time. And then every now and then there'd be a comment for saying, I did it and I couldn't believe it. I actually got a referral. And that's what they needed to hear. When people saw that, their peers talking about their successes, that's when they're like, oh, damn it, now I'll have to do it. And that helps them kind of overcome that fear because they've seen other people make the jump before them. Cool, I think I'm through most of the questions today. I really enjoyed that session. As you can probably tell, I'm quite passionate about the topic. If you've got any other follow-up questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I'm going to let you all enjoy your lunch. Thanks very much for coming.